Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker, and I'm really honored and privileged to have on this guest we've had on a few times, and a very good friend, person that's kind of was a legend on Reddit and now has really branched out in many ways, has appeared on my show to talk about their faith journey and also their sexuality and gender, which we've had some really good conversations about, and your faith journey in going into being a part of the community of Christ and also being an activist within the community of Christ to try to bring about some changes and reforms to the church. And then ultimately you decided not that long ago that you were going to part company with the community of Christ. And so we're going to talk about that, but we're also going to talk about new scripture, new restorationist scripture brought forth by my guest, Evan Sharley. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Steve. It's good to be back.
So yeah, this is really exciting. Actually, I read through some of the scriptures that you sent me. And I want people to stick around for this whole interview because I think it's really an important one. But also, we have new restorationist scripture that's come forth. And within the context of the restoration, there's this anticipation that new scripture would come forth from different places throughout the world. And of course, we've had Matthew Gill on to talk about that. And we've talked, just had other people within the restoration who are part of that tradition of scripture coming forth. And so we'll let the audience decide. This is what I do is I just let people come on and make their presentations or make their case, and I encourage people to engage the claims and the scriptures and everything like that. But we're going to talk first, Evan, about your journey out of the community of Christ. And by the way, we're filming on the 4th of July. Happy 4th of July. And thanks for
Happy
doing this
Fourth.
today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's my spiritual journey has always been an interesting one. Just always like a rolling freight train, just keep moving forward. And um, so to really kind of begin my journey out of Community of Christ, we got to go back a couple years. Um, to begin, I'm polyamorous. I have multiple partners, and my partners have multiple partners, and it's just a web of relationships, which I love, and we all love it. Um, Community of Christ, however, was largely founded as a reaction to Brigham Young's polygamy, which of
Evan,
course
just
we
real
know.
quick, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I was literally talking to a friend yesterday. I was hanging out and I mentioned polyamorous and you're like, what's that? So maybe,
Mhm.
not a lot of people, it's not a term they're terribly familiar with. So why don't you just tell us what is polyamory?
Yeah, so polyamory is I have more than one romantic and sexual relationship. Um, and it's different from polygamy and polyandry. Polygamy is the men are allowed to have multiple wives, and polyandry is the women are allowed to have multiple husbands. Um, with polyamory, anybody is allowed to have multiple partners. And so I'm married to my wife. My wife and I are dating our non-binary partner.
Okay.
Um, and I am also dating um, my girlfriend, and my non-binary partner has a couple of people in their life. And so just a whole web of connections and relationships and everything like that.
Okay. Well, thank you for defining that. And so, and this is like part of your engagement. Of course, you came out of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and went
Mhm.
into the community of Christ with this understanding that they would be open to people, part of the queer and LGBTQ community in general. And so maybe set that up there, maybe just talk to that.
Yeah, so Community of Christ definitely puts itself forward as being queer inclusive. Um, I like to say, there's the aspiration and then there's the lived reality. Um, they have great aspirations, Community of Christ, but the lived reality is not quite as accepting and inclusive as we would hope it would be. And it's very patchworked. So, for example, in the United States, they have formally recognized queer relationships and queer priesthood. But, for example, in Mexico, they have not. So you could have the priesthood in Texas and then cross the border into Mexico, and you technically don't have the priesthood anymore.
Hmm.
Very, very patchwork. how they've done inclusion. And they don't like to talk about it. um, but I came into Community of Christ because I believed that I would be accepted and loved for who I was and who I am. And John Hamer's congregation, definitely I felt comfortable being myself, including openly being polyamorous. But as polyamorous people such as myself came out of the closet more and more, the upper echelons of the Community of Christ took notice and they issued a policy in February of 2023. Uh, well, it was issued in January. We discovered it in February. They did not publicly announce it, and they still haven't publicly acknowledged it. This policy specifically said that families such as mine, any member of a family such as mine, no longer qualifies for priesthood. It defined people like me as second-class citizens in Community of Christ, which I was told would not happen.
Hmm.
And that was difficult. I took a couple steps back from Community of Christ for a number of months. I didn't go to their world conference, even though I was putting forth legislation at that world conference. Um, and ultimately, I decided to step back into Community of Christ for a time so that I could advocate for families like mine. And I wrote some like informational. I wrote an entire book on what it means to be polyamorous and from a Community of Christ perspective and how we could be included theologically. I gave a Sunstone presentation on it. Um, did a lot of work to try to make families like mine understood and known and loved and accepted in that church. Um, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was falling on deaf ears.
Hmm.
And so earlier this year in 2024, I decided that I was going to print off all of these resources that I had made um, and send a copy to each member of the First Presidency. And I did. And I urged them to read it and I urged them to accept me for who I am and accept my family and not treat us as second class citizens. And I was lamenting to my partners about it and like told them how difficult it was not being treated with respect, not being treated with dignity. And they very gently said, "What are you getting out of this church still? Like, it seems like your spirituality has largely been taken up by this advocacy work, and you're not getting the fulfillment that you really wanted out of it anymore." And I was like, damn, you know what? You guys are right. And so I decided to email the First Presidency and said, hey, I want to let you guys know that if you guys aren't willing to even have a conversation with me, like we don't have to have this conversation soon because I know Stacey Cram was just picked as the successor, and I I said like we don't even have to have a conversation soon. I just want to know that you guys are willing to have a conversation with people like me. And if you guys aren't willing to have a conversation like that, then I think I need to resign and move on. Be of Christ. I said I'm going to give you guys 2 weeks. There's no requirement for when we have to have this conversation, but I want some sort of an indication that you are willing to talk to me and I'm not just yelling into the void. And I got nothing.
So they never responded back to you,
Nope.
even though you are younger than most. You're kind of like represent the future of the Community of Christ. You're an activist who was very, very involved in advocacy as well as passing, like, if you will, legislations or different things at the World Conference. So you're definitely one of the more visible members, were one of the most visible members of the Community of Christ, and of course are part of John Hamer's, well-known congregation. So why do you feel I'm just kind of surprised that they wouldn't have at least send you an acknowledgement or something of just even that. Why do you suppose they never got back to you?
I don't know. I
Nobody's ever reached out. Hmm, interesting. Folks, I just want to say, I've had a great relationship with the Community of Christ. Um, I presented it to John Whitmer Historical Association last year, which is part of the church. I've had many, many Community of Christ people come on the program. I gave a sermon at my local Community of Christ here a couple years ago. The week I was going on Mormon Stories, that Sunday I gave a sermon at the Community of Christ. And I'm good with the people locally too. So I just want to say that, I just feel so bad because you're my friend, Evan, and I feel like, church is the most important thing a church needs to look out for is, you got the 99 and you got the one. And I'm just saddened to hear that that didn't happen to you. Um, and I don't know. Is this because it's just a bureaucracy or I don't know, or maybe you're just too hot to handle and they don't want to deal with the issues that you're bringing into this? I mean, what do you attribute it to?
I think at the root of this is Community of Christ, again, was largely founded as a reaction to
Yes.
Brigamite polygamy.
Polygamy. Yep.
Um, Emma Smith, Joseph Smith III were very, very big parts of the foundation of Community of Christ. And I think a lot of the trauma from Joseph Smith practicing polygamy got infused into the structure and tradition of Community of Christ. And that generational trauma just has never been dealt with. And so, with families like mine, even though we're not polygamist, um, they see cosmetic similarities and they don't know how to handle that trauma because they haven't worked through it. Um, and I don't think that families like mine will be accepted in Community of Christ until there is a little bit more systemic healing regarding that trauma that has never been dealt with.
Okay, yeah, I think you're right. And we've had similar conversations about that in the past, that I think it's because, like you said, that there's the similarities that they see. Just that, I mean, I think what they're afraid of is, would this open the door to polygamy even into their church too, right? Because so there's a lot that they're dealing with, and I understand that, like that I get why they'd want to shy away from that controversy, especially considering the state of the church as it stands too. I think that that's one of the things I really do love and appreciate, the rich tapestry and history of the RLDS, the Community of Christ. And actually, I really feel like sometimes this is kind of something that was in the making for decades. Um, I don't want to be overly critical here, but I think if we look at like the United Methodist Church and how it handled, um, it allowed a lot more freedom on the individual congregational level, and we see this in other denominations. And yes, we ultimately did see a split in the United Methodist Church, but I really feel like it was much more amicable than what we saw with the RLDS, where it was kind of, you just have to follow this, and it caused there to be about a quarter to a third of the people left. And people talk about, the pain and stuff that they're feeling about the sale of the Kirtland Temple and the other properties. But I said, I talked to people that have been weeping and grieving for 40 years for what happened. And so, whether either way, where you stand on it's not relevant. It's almost like, how did they handle it? And it almost seems like over the course of the last 40 years, there's just been a lot of missteps. And where if they had just done it a little bit differently, it probably wouldn't have led to a huge amount of people leaving and kind of crippling the church. And it's like, I don't know. What do you say to that? Just kind of, do you think this is something that was decades in the making?
Um, I think we could go back to what the RLDS calls supreme directional control,
Yes. Now talk a little bit about
which,
this. Give the little history of that, because I think it's important.
yeah,
And by the way, I'm going to have John Hamer come on again, and we're going to have a in-depth conversation about that period as well. So
yeah. Suffice it to say, the reorganization was set up to where there were different governing bodies that were all equal in authority. Um, when Frederick Madison Smith, the third prophet of the reorganization, when he came on the scene, he said, "Yeah, we're all equal in authority, but who's first? It's me, right?" um, and Fred M ended up saying, like, listen, you guys either accept that I have supreme directional control or I'm going to resign as president. And the church ended up um, accepting his supreme directional control. And so since then, there has kind of been echoes of that, where IHQ, World Church, kind of the federal government of Community of Christ, if you will, has a lot of power. Um, we saw that with DNC 156, where they were really heavy-handed with the conservatives who ended up splitting off as a result. Um, Now they're kind of being heavy-handed with polyamorous people. Like, we are such a hyper minority, and the fact that they took the time to create a policy against people like me is ridiculous.
And that's the
And
thing.
so,
They never consulted you either when they
mhm.
came up with this policy. And it just makes you wonder because this, of course, this is a church that talks about, we're a prophetic people, and there's a lot of the idea of having just being able to listen to the congregants, and it's more democratic. That that they that they would write this policy without consulting somebody from your community. It just seems odd because this is a church that has said that we are going to, it's about being inclusive and affirming, and it just seems it would be like them coming up with a policy about with LGBTQ people without consulting them one way or another. It just whether so it just seemed like I don't know. I wonder, is this, again, I don't want to be overly critical because I really do appreciate and love many of the people of the church, but I just really feel like there's like a series of missteps that have been going on here. And it seems like they haven't learned from the mistakes in their past. They seem to be repeating them with your community.
Yep. It's it's difficult to see because like I was willing to stay if they were willing to talk.
Okay, that's
Um,
interesting. Okay. That's a good point. And I think it's important because you and I've had conversations for a while now. And I had even
mhm.
advocated, why don't you stay, but then understanding now that they never got back to you kind of was sending you a message that perhaps you no longer felt welcomed in the church.
And I have received letters. Like when I joined Community of Christ, I actually mailed Steve Beasy a letter introducing myself, coming out as polyamorous right from the get-go. And he mailed me back. He wrote a letter to me back. So I know that they get these letters. It feels like willful inaction. It feels like I wasn't important enough. Um, and the thing about it is, I know I'm a little bit louder than most people, a little bit more vocal. um, I know of about a half dozen people under the age of 35 that have all disaffiliated from Community of Christ over this, um, because they're polyamorous. A lot of people are in the closet and don't feel safe. And now Community of Christ, with how they treated me, it's has implicitly said that we're not important enough to keep in the community. We're not important enough to make feel welcome,
Yeah, I'm
which was
so sorry
difficult.
this happened to you. I really am because it really can be hurtful because you had left the Utah based church and you thought you had a community in the community of Christ, and now you're kind of, but you still have this is what's so fascinating to me is I remember having conversations with you in the past about, hey, well, would you consider joining this group or that group that were part of the broader Christian context? And you said, I want my home to be in the restoration. That's like so important to you. And so maybe just speak to that because we're so was there anything else you wanted to talk about leaving the church, or did you want to start talking about maybe where you're going now, or maybe go from there?
Yeah, I think I'd like to shift into
Yeah,
looking
let's do
forward.
that. So you're basically saying you're not leaving the restoration.
Hmm.
You're in this.
My family joined the Restoration in 1835. Um, like Lyman White baptized my family into
Oh,
the Restoration. Um, I actually got to meet one of Lyman White's descendants, which was fun. Um, but like it's home. It always has been home. It always will be home. I get frustrated with the different cousins and everything like that, but at the end of the day, it's still my family. It's still my home, and I want to find a place and find a way to feel comfortable in it for myself. And ideally help other people feel comfortable and loved and accepted in it as well.
yeah. And so where is Evan at now? Like, this is the thing. Like, I've got Steve Shields' books, 700 groups and expressions within the restoration, even more. And just there's all these different manifestations. We, of course, I've had a gentleman on talking about Reform Mormonism, Lauer.
Mhm.
He's
Yep,
come on and
Rob.
talked about that. And so just speak to like where, okay, so now you're in this, you're still in the restoration, but now you're kind of trying to find a safe space for you to continue in your spiritual journey. So maybe talk about what that journey looks like and what you've been encountering.
Mhm. Um, so um, I'm an odd duck. I know I'm an odd duck. Um, One of the very important things to my spirituality is entheogens, the spiritual use of psychedelics. The Smith entheogen theory, I'm very accepting of. That is actually what made me realize that there may be some spiritual value in the restoration for me still.
Hmm.
Um, and there are no organizations that are super keen on entheogenic use. So I've kind of got like a small group of friends. We meet every week or two. Um, let's talk about, our spirituality, um, fellowship with one another, get to know each other. They're all people who are connected to the restoration that are interested in entheogens. Um, we have talked about like formally organizing, making something a little bit more systemic, but right now it's very grassroots. Um, and it kind of feels like we're all kind of solo practitioners together. And we're able, there's no hierarchy, there's nothing like that. We're able to just kind of learn there as a community should, um, which has been nice. Putting aside the entheogens, Reform Mormonism, Rob Lauer, um, those group of folks are fantastic. I'm part of their Facebook group. Um, I'm also a big fan of the Church of Jesus Christ and Christian Fellowship, uh, David Ferriman's church.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Um,
David, yeah,
yeah, he's a good guy. I chat with him every couple of days.
yeah. I gotta have him back on. Yeah, he's an interesting dude. Yeah, like
He
the
is an interesting guy.
yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, one cool thing about David's church, in reaction to Community of Christ February policy, his church actually issued an explicit policy of inclusion for polyamorous families like mine, um, which I was quite touched by. Um, but yeah, for the time being, I'm kind of a solo practitioner, kind of studying on my own, kind of exploring on my own. I've been quite interested in the concepts of apotheosis, which is, the fancy dancy theological term for becoming a god, which is kind of a late Nauvoo era theological innovation, and also the divine feminine. Um, Mormonism is unique in that it acknowledges a divine feminine, and as a trans woman, I am intensely intrigued by the concept of divine femininity. So it's been really fun and interesting exploring that for myself as well.
So, just so people maybe not like you use the term ethnogens and stuff like that. Just talk
Mhm.
a bit about because we've had guests on, of course, we've talked about this issue and it's bubbling there. It's something that's really fascinating to people. Maybe just describe what is this idea that perhaps the early saints were engaging in these with these substances, and that was actually kind of the foundation in many ways of the restoration. This is a
Yeah.
theory, a hypothesis, but I think it's interesting and something that we need to discuss.
Yeah, this theory was really kind of grassroots started less than a decade ago. Um, and there's been a lot of work done, and kind of the next steps are chemical testing to see, like, do these wine barrels have any trace of psilocybin in them? Wine barrels that were used at the Kirtland Temple dedication, that kind of stuff, in order to see if there's any smoking gun that may exist. We'll see. But I tend to subscribe to the Smith entheogen theory. It it just makes sense to me. Um, Growing up, I was always very, very intrigued by the experiences that happened at the Kirtland Temple dedication. People seeing visions and angels and God and speaking in tongues and just really unique ways. Experiences that weren't just Pentecostal. There were Pentecostal folks that were like, I know Pentecostalism and that's not it. um, for example, is one of those people. He was actually a doctor that said, like, I think they put something in the wine.
Now, you
I
you
want to
just you
distill
just broke up. Who was this that was the doctor that said this?
J.J. Moss.
Okay. And this person was like, I think they're taking some kind of substances, is what. Okay.
Hmm. Yep. And that was in the early Kirtland days,
Okay.
um, where that happened. It's very, very interesting. And I wanted to have that kind of theophanic experience of, encountering divinity for myself in a very overt way, growing up as a teenager, and I never got it until I tried psychedelics for the first time. And I was like, this is the Kirtland endowment that I've been looking for my entire life.
Huh. So just so you know, I have never ingested any hallucinogens or anything like that. I've smoked pot a few times, but that's it. Not a big fan of it, to be honest with you. So never really dealt with it. But can you kind of describe to the audience in the best way that you can, that you feel comfortable with talking about why do you feel that these experiences you have and are indeed spiritual ones, and that they may very well in your mind be likely what was happening in the early Kirtland period?
It's it's difficult to express to folks who have not had similar experiences. A lot of people rely upon using language used to describe dreams, very powerful and meaningful dreams. Um, Mormonism is unique in that it also had very overt visionary experiences as well. Um, and I believe a lot of those visionary experiences were actually psychedelic experiences. And so if you read those accounts of those visions, they are actually accounts of uh, psychedelic experiences. I've had very similar experiences myself. Um, what Joseph Smith had with, the visions of salvation um, in 1836, where he saw his brother Hiram in the celestial kingdom and he saw the heavens open and part and everything like that. It's gorgeous and indescribable and so healing and so full of love. visual, it's emotional, um, it's connecting, it's beautiful. Um, I tend to think that if your body is physically healthy enough to try a psychedelic experience, you shouldn't go a lifetime without trying it at least once.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
it's oh, I would be so castigated in as much trouble I am in the evangelical world. Oh my gosh, if I started doing that stuff, they would just completely write me off. If they haven't already, I don't really care. But it's just kind of funny to think. But and actually, it's interesting because I remember. Okay, so I think his name is Steve as well. He's this former state senator from Utah who's starting the psychedelic church. He's got that in Utah. Is that you know who I'm talking about?
Yes.
I,
Blanking on his last name.
yeah,
But
but
yes.
he was featured in Rolling Stone and stuff like that. And so I've actually encountered him a couple times. And he was I met him for first time I went to Sunstone. I met him, and the second time he actually showed up for last year for the movie screening we did in downtown Salt Lake City. And I just remember the first conversation I ever had with him is I said, you know, and I'm not being prescriptive, I'm being descriptive when I say this, in that I said, I predict that within, and I told him at the time, maybe in the next 10 to 20 years, but I actually think it could happen sooner, that within the next 10 to 20 years, we might see Pentecostal charismatics, some within the movement starting to embracing using these substances and integrating them into their worship services. He looked right at me and says, "Oh man, I would do anything to go see a Pentecostal service where they're tripping." And I always found that to be amusing, but that's kind of where I think we're going to start seeing. I think this is kind of a fringy thing right now, but I think as this stuff gets more and more mainstream, and honestly, I think I would say I was very skeptical of this whole theory. Probably about 6, 7 years ago, Joe Rogan had a guest on, and they were talking about this stuff and just the amazing experiences people would have that are deeply spiritual, like life-changing spiritual lives. I mean, just amazing. We also know that, people who would quit smoking, like lifetime smokers, would do like a session or two, and they would just literally like their world just clicked, it changed, and they just walked away.
Did
And
you know that the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous wanted to include a step of taking LSD as part of Alcoholics Anonymous?
oh,
Anonymous?
yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
no,
it.
that's fascinating. And so it's and again, this is the thing is like we can go back and see even religion in its most primitive forms that we can see that substances have been used in religious practices and rituals that go back millennia. And
Mhm.
so this idea that this isn't something that we wouldn't find in the Jewish, in the Hebrew Judaism, or we wouldn't find in first century Christianity, there's been a lot of people that this whole idea stems out of a greater idea that they were spiking the wine in the first century of the Christian church, and that would explain the visions they had of Jesus and all this kind of stuff. Again, this is a hypothesis, but I'm also telling you that, folks, you have to understand the one thing we understand about these substances is that they're just activating something in your brain that's already there. And so it's more of an internal thing that's happening. It's just activating something that's already there. So this is, if you will, a process that one could argue that, people that go on fasting or repetitive prayers sometimes can also activate these very same things that would give them these ecstatic experiences. So this is not so far out. And again, it doesn't mean there's not a God. It could mean that this is how God uses that part of your brain to communicate to you in the divine. So that's just one way to look at it. Maybe speak to that a little bit because I'm just
Yeah,
by it.
there is a delineation I think would be helpful when
Okay.
talking about this kind of stuff. So, when we think of traditional Pentecostalism, we think, dancing, singing, um, that kind of stuff that kind of does it naturally in your body. That's what's referred to as endogenous,
Okay.
where those sorts of chemicals are being created in your brain.
Okay.
Um, Exogenous is when you consume something to help facilitate that. And so when I hear people say, like, oh, you weren't having a spiritual experience. You just took mushrooms. I like to say like, oh, well, you weren't having a spiritual experience. You were just singing. Like these are how they're the means by which you can experience divinity.
Yeah, so that's where it all comes down to. And so, and that's just it's just an interesting thing I think that needs to be covered and try to, and now this is becoming more mainstream. I guess you had said they're going to be giving three presentations about this at Sunstones, three separate ones. So this is becoming more and more part of the. I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing this stuff's talked about at the MHA and JWHA as well down the road. I think it's starting to get into the bloodstream there as well. And I'm like, it's just, and again, we have when we're having conversations about the restoration, this is part of the conversation and the movement that you're part of. And uh, I guess, where do you see this going? Do you think that you'll start an actual church or a fellowship, or how are you even phrasing this? What do you guys consider yourselves? Like a church, a fellowship, expression?
Um, those are all kind of words, different words for the same thing.
Sure.
A lot of people are uncomfortable with the word church. Um, Even Community of Christ transitioned away from using the word church in favor of community. Um, I what I know is that hierarchy should not play as pivotal of a role. The Restoration struggles with consolidating power into the hands of just a few people, um, which I think consistently is a mistake because it sets someone up as on a podium to say, this is the will and mind of God, and if you don't like it, I'm going to excommunicate you. I think that's a problem. Um, I think it needs to be much more of a community religion in order for it to be effective moving forward.
Okay.
And we're still trying to figure out what that could look like, what kind of structures we could do, um, what kind of checks and balances we may need, for that kind of thing. But like it's very, very possible at this point that we will formally organize into a 501(c)(3) recognized religious institution or something similar.
So then, of course, when you decide to do this, I'll be more than happy to have you all come back on the program to discuss it. And what's so interesting is within the content. Oh, what were you going to say something?
And if there are any entheogenic Mormons, psychedelic Mormons that are out there, definitely reach out to me. I'd love to chat with you and connect and help you connect with other people too. So
Yeah, so
don't
you
be
could
afraid
front.
to give me a shout.
Yeah, yeah. You can reach out on Facebook, and also you have a website that will have a link in the description to as well for more information regarding that. So, one of the most fascinating things about the restoration is that um, there's this idea of the coming forth of new scripture. This is something
Mhm.
that's anticipated, and this is something that is supposed to happen. And I think in many people's more frequently than it has. I think many people, there are other people, other scriptures that have come forth that haven't been recognized by the Utah branch, but are recognized by other groups. And what's so fascinating is you are now one of the new um, producers of scripture within the restoration. And I wanted to just have you talk about that. And I'm going to go to share screen and we can talk a little bit about that. But
Yeah.
tell us about this new scripture. That's part of that's a new restoration scripture.
So I have the Book of the Lavens. This is a book about it's a pseudo-depigraphic midrash of Third and Fourth Nephi.
Okay, so what
Uh,
is that? Tell us what that means.
I know that's a lot of big words. So pseudo-depigrapha means the purported author is not the true author.
Okay.
Um, so, for example, The Hobbit was said to be a translation of the Red Book of Westmarch that was written by Bilbo Baggins. Um, But obviously, Bilbo Baggins didn't write The Hobbit because he's a fictional character. Um, J.K. or
J.K. Rowling.
no, Tolkien.
Oh, yeah, J.R. Tolkien. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Tolkien wrote um, Lord of the Rings,
Right, right.
not Bilbo.
Sorry.
um, and that's how I approach Lavens as well. Of like I'm telling it from the perspective of characters within the book, namely the 12 disciples or 12 apostles that Christ chooses out of the Nephites.
Yep, I
And
have it on
now,
here, the description on the back of the book. I'm just going to read it real quick. This
mhm,
scripture tells the tales of the Lavens, a group exiled from the Nephite tribes who formed their own tribe after the assassination of the chief judge. Uh, can you help me with the pronunciation? Lochnius?
I pronounce it Laconius.
Laconius, that sounds, yeah, that's how I would too. Laconius, the younger. It expounds upon the lives, experiences, and ministries of those disciples whom Christ had chosen to teach and lead in the promised land after he departed. All these disciples, in today's terminology, would be considered queer. So is Lavens another term to use for queer people within the Book of Mormon context?
So queer people aren't mentioned in the Book of Mormon at
Okay,
all. There's no condoning or condemning of it.
right.
Um, in the introduction of the Book of the Lavens, I pronounce it Lavens.
Okay. Lavin.
Um, it I talk about how the Book of Mormon was a successful book of scripture because it spoke to the needs of the people from when it was brought forth. It uniquely speaks to the problems that existed in early America, in New England America. Likewise, the Book of the Lavens speaks about important issues for today, namely queer issues, inclusion of women, entheogenic usage, that kind of thing. I really believed, you know, we trans people, we queer people in general, deserve to see ourselves reflected in scriptural stories, and we haven't been, and we deserve to. And that's what the Lavens does, is it provides stories which reflect our lived experiences.
Huh. And just what does Lavin mean? Exactly?
Um, Lavin, I chose, let me back up just a little bit.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I I wrote the Book of the Lavens. I don't have any miraculous story or anything associated with it. I don't think a miraculous story is important or even necessary for the coming forth of Scripture. And in some regards, I think can actually detract from the content of what's actually written. Nevertheless, I believe that what I have written can speak profoundly to the spiritual needs of people today, just like the Book of Mormon did in the 1830s. And so when I was kind of thinking like, what would these group of people be called? I decided to go with Lavin because it's shortened from lavender. Um, and lavender, for those who don't know, is an important color in queer culture.
Okay.
Um, Back when we had significantly fewer rights, there were protesters, advocates who were called the Lavender Menaces.
Yep.
Um, and so it is really indicating like these are queer people. This is, you could say this is the book of queer people.
Okay. Okay. Wow, that's interesting. And so, and what's so interesting is that you had brought up earlier about the hierarchical nature of the church, and that actually that's kind of like the theme of the book is the hierarchy and how it does to oppress people that are different and expels them. Um, and also it begins kind of like during an excessive time of the, if you will, within the pride cycle, even, that you have all this stuff going on that, so it's kind of a an addendum, if you will, that attaches itself to the Book of Mormon story, and then tells the story of people that, presumably, with in all ancient cultures and societies, we all know that there's always been queer people. So
Hmm.
presumably within the Book of Mormon context, even though they're never addressed, and honestly, women are rarely addressed in the Book of Mormon either. You have gave voices to queer people as well as female voices in this story. Maybe just talk about that interaction and also the conversation. So people like to talk about the conversation the Book of Mormon is having with the Bible. Talk about the conversation that your scriptures are having with the Book of Mormon.
Hmm. So as you know, I absolutely love the restoration. I absolutely love, 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 love it. Everything about it. I love all the distinctives from it. And so I wanted to create, you called it an addendum. I call it a midrash.
Okay,
So
yep.
I kind of expounded upon some of the
Midrash. That's
things.
yeah, I like that. Yep.
Mhm. Um, I expounded upon the time frame that takes place in Third and Fourth Nephi, and tell it from the perspective of these queer people. Um, I read Third and Fourth Nephi dozens of times to make sure, like, when I reference anything, that it references something correctly in the Book of Mormon. Um, I wanted to step into the restoration tradition and honor it because I do honor it and I do love our restoration tradition. Um, I just wanted people like me to be reflected in that tradition through our scriptural writing tradition. Um, and it's been so healing for me. I've shared it with other queer people, even those who aren't in the restoration. I'm like, wow, this is really powerful. Thank you for helping bring this forward and everything like that. And so it's nice being able to honor my tradition and also who I am.
Well, and maybe just also talk about how people like to talk about how like Joseph Smith's his the culture and background that he was in. He was where he was located, um, what kind of works that he would have been exposed to, and other ideas that he would have been exposed to that perhaps found their way into the Book of Mormon and into other Latter-day Saint scriptures. That Joseph Smith, as the translator, was also kind of having a conversation, and many people feel, and many Dan Vogel and Richard Bushman have pointed out how in many ways the story of Joseph Smith and his family is also kind of told in the Book of Mormon as well. The dynamics is your where would we find some of your story told in the pages of your scripture?
Um, there are a couple of characters that I identify with more than others. There are a couple of characters that I named after friends that I admire, and these people do things that are modeled after things that my friends did. Um, there are things that I was inspired by different theologians or activists and how they phrased things or approached things, and I kind of integrated it into my book. Um, Alexander Campbell once said, Joseph Smith is more versed with the controversies of New York than the history or geography of Judea. I don't think that's a bad thing because Joseph Smith was speaking to the needs of his people in his day, and I wanted to do the same. Um, and in that regard, I'm interacting with my tradition, but also the things that are important to me and my identity and my sexual orientation, my gender identity, and everything like that, which are important to me too, and I know are important to other queer people.
Yeah, that's I love this. I think it's I love the idea. Look, the Book of Mormon is an audacious book. Um, the Book of Lavens is an audacious book in much the same way. And I just want to just page through this real quick, folks, so you can get an idea. This is This is a table of contents, and we have chapters, we have versification going on. It's easy to read. And also, what I find fascinating is that you have some of the script in both red and blue. The red being like the voice of the divine, and then look, she protested, her voice, heavy with despair. And then we hear the voice, um, and so you actually have it that way. I am Laven. I am a Laven. Um, so just talk about maybe the format of your scriptures and how you had set it up, and then also talk about how people can actually get their hands on these as well.
Yeah. So I formatted it. Um, the Book of Mormon is often told from the perspective of the compiler, but also directly quotes characters that it's supposedly being compiled from. And I wanted to do the same thing. But growing up, I often struggled with like, okay, when did this person start talking?
Ah, yeah.
Um, and like, who's talking? Is this supposed to be God? Is this Nephi talking? I'm a little confused. And so I wanted to be able to make that distinction relatively easily by having the different colored texts. So black is just like the author of that book. Um, Blue is when humanity is directly speaking, and red is when divinity is directly speaking. Um, yeah, it helps me keep track of things a
Yeah,
little
no, I
bit
like
better
that.
like that.
Yeah, no, I think that you're integrating some ideas that have been out there. Of course, we've got red letter editions of the
Yes.
Bible that now have made their way into the Book of Mormon. We also have like Rob Meldrum's edition of the Book of Mormon that has red and blue script as well. The blue
Hmm.
with the angelic voices in that case. So we're
Yes.
having just a lot of interesting experimentation going on and formatting it and stuff like that. And so will people be able to um, download this? We'll have a link in the description. It's when will this be available to the public as well? Is it because I know mine is just a early edition. When are you planning on launching this thing?
So if you're watching this video, it's already available. I'll make sure it's available by then.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll have a link in
Um,
the description.
yep.
And then what if somebody
Um,
wanted to order a hard copy, is that possible, or is it all just going to be digital right now?
so one thing about my spirituality is I absolutely refuse to have money involved with it.
Okay.
I think when money and spirituality mingle with one another, they bring out the worst in each other.
Okay.
And so I'm making the PDF available for free. And if anybody absolutely must have a physical copy, I will personally foot the bill for it because I would rather give it as a gift than charge anyone for it.
Oh, wow. Wow. Hmm. Wow. So you would do that. So yeah. Okay. Well, um, interesting. And so there won't be any money exchanged here. It's all free and it's out
And
there.
I am actually also putting it in the public domain.
Yeah.
So you can print it off yourself if you would like to. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I noticed in you actually have that spelled out at the beginning,
Hmm.
where you kind of give like as long as people are, not, not you cannot sell it. So and
Hmm.
you can't, so you want to have everything, you know, accurate and everything like that. So that's the stipulations. But yeah, so this is a new scripture within the context of the restoration that is freely available to the public, and we'll have links in the description. And it's another another set of scriptures, if you will. And you're making, so now you I guess the question, Evan, is it begs the question people are going to ask is you're starting a church and you're producing scripture. Who is Evan Sharley? Is Evan Sharley a prophetess?
I mean, that gets into the question of like, what is a prophet? What is a prophetess kind of deal? I don't want to be a president of a church or anything like that. It's not my place to dictate people's relationship with divinity. Um, if people want help or, companionship, I'm more than happy to offer that. I recently did a vow renewal for some friends who I've been a big part of their spiritual journey, and they wanted me to officiate their vow renewal. And so I was happy to do that. But like, I am not interested in telling people what to do, say, believe, or anything like that. And I think anybody that does do that is getting spirituality wrong.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to, um, okay, is it, you can see, can you see your website on here? Just to make sure.
Yes.
Okay. So this is your, how do you say this? I bet you can't pronounce it, so I'm going to ask you to.
For a long time, I refused to say how to pronounce it. Um, it's pronounced Gillerio de Kell.
Villarreal de Cal. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. I'll work on that.
Yeah.
And actually, beforehand, you sent me this article you wrote. How many Easters do we think the community of Christ has left? And, that kind of talks about your concern about the future of the community of Christ. Of course, we recently had the Kirtland Temple sale, and there were some people that were a little upset that I broke the story, but it was going to come out anyhow. But well, John Hychek, came on my platform to break the story. I want to make sure we give credit to John. But it's kind of just been a tumultuous last few months for the community of Christ with all this stuff that's been going down. And I guess, Evan, I just want to ask you, you've sensed a part of the community of Christ, and I just want maybe speak from your heart. What do you want to say? And I'm putting you on the spot here because I didn't prep it for you. But what's on your heart? Like, I know that in one sense you still have a heart for the people of the community of Christ in that church. So what's on your heart? What do you want to say to them where they're at right now?
I, to put it out there officially on your show and everything like that, I'm willing to return to Community of Christ, but I refuse to be treated as a second class citizen. And so if they are willing to lift the February policy, I would rejoin almost immediately. I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. Um, and if you take a look at that post on my website, some of the statistics regarding Community of Christ are pretty grim, which is unfortunate. It's a time-honored tradition of the Restoration. They were the stewards of so much of our history for such a long time. But like Community of Christ has been releasing tithing statistics and demographics, more than 75% of tithing donors to Community of Christ are over the age of 65. More than 70%, 75% are over the age of 65. So within the next 15 to 20 years, Community of Christ will likely see more than 75% reduction of tithing revenue. Um, Community of Christ can't afford to keep alienating its young people because if they keep doing that, they will not be here in a generation.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for speaking for your community, for your generation. I think it's really important, folks. So we have all these, you know, I we have difficult conversations here at Mormon Book Reviews. We're not afraid to have those conversations. We're not afraid to have adult conversations. And for those of you in the community of Christ that might still be a little mad at me, I just want to say, listen, I love you and I appreciate the hurt that you were feeling at the time. I feel like this was the case of shooting the messenger at times, which I feel like we need to kind of move on from that. And so, but I'm willing to speak and talk to anybody within the community. I hear from a ton of you in the community of Christ. Most of you are very supportive. I love all of you. I love the great conversations we've had. When look, I was on the phone crying with members of the church, people who were their livelihoods were completely devastated by it. And so for me, it's like I felt it. And it took me about 48 hours to really feel the pain once the story broke. And I started breaking down on Facebook Live once about it because I just felt so hurt for the community of Christ. And so I just want to say I love and appreciate the people of the community of Christ and so many of the great things that it has done. And we hope that it will flourish in the future. And Evans even put out an olive branch saying, listen, I'll come back. And so, he's holding out, he is holding out the olive branch. It's up to you whether you want to take it or not, I guess, in one sense. But before we wrap this up, was there any other final words you wanted to share with the audience or anything else you wanted to plug?
Um, Feel free to read Book of the Lavens. It has a lot of queer representation. There's non-binary folks, there's trans men, there's trans women. Um, the three Nephites are a polyamorous triad. Um, and it feels good seeing so much queer representation within a scriptural setting like this. So it's
Okay.
been very healing for me, and I hope it's healing for others as well.
Well, folks, of course, those of you who are more traditional and conservative in your approach, and of course, many of you are in my audience, I imagine that Evan says things that make you feel a little uncomfortable, and that's okay because we're talking about an individual who's having their own relationship with the divine, and their spiritual experiences have led them in the path that they're going, including creating, helping produce scripture within the restoration. um, it's an interesting conversation. And like I said, we talked to everybody here. And I'm so glad, one, that we're friends. Um, we've spent time together, which is great. I'm going to try to get the Sunstone this year, depending on my health condition. Um, and that's going to be in a little about a month, less than a month from here. So I'm going to try to get out the Sunstone. But I just want to, just tell you I appreciate our friendship and the insights you bring to the table. And and this is the thing, I get feedback from other people about you, and it's always positive. Like even
Oh,
people, even conservatives have told me that they really respect how you are respectful to people that maybe don't share your beliefs, that you still have that, you recognize the dignity of the individual, which I think in today's culture, I think is so important. You and I on paper should maybe be fighting each other, but I don't see any reason why we need to fight each other, and I don't see any reason why we can't be friends. And I think it's really important that our audience gets to share be part of this conversation, and we get to share it with them too.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, especially like in the restoration, a lot of us literally are family. Um, like I said, like my family has been journeying in the restoration with the white family since 1835.
yeah.
Like we're all connected, we're all family. We should act like it.
Okay. Well, yeah, and there's always going to be in the families, there's always going to be all different types of people, and we need to learn to just be more understanding and accepting of people that are different than us. I think that's really important that we recognize the humanity and the individual divinity of everybody and look at them that way as opposed to enemies or people that we need to fight, because Lord knows we know where that goes, and it is never pretty when that happens. So well, folks, we're going to have links in the description to everything that we talked about. For those of you who'd like to financially support the channel, we have links there too. And I'd love to hear your comments, folks. And then those of you who download the scriptures, um, why don't you download them, read them, and then leave comments about it. We'd like to hear about it. And of course, reach out to Evan on Facebook as well as on the website and give them your feedback as well. And remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.